My mom is inviting you to dinner today. I read that text message from my fiancé 24 hours before our wedding, assuming it would be a standard rehearsal dinner. But by the end of the evening, my future mother-in-law leaned over her half-eaten lobster and whispered something in Italian to my husband. They both laughed, looking at me, like I was a sheep being led to the slaughter. Before leaving the table, I smiled, took my mother-in-law by the hand, squeezed her fingers until her diamond rings dug painfully into her bone, and replied in perfect Italian. My name is Nora, and at 33 years old, I was about to marry into a family of absolute parasites. I am the founder and chief executive officer of a digital forensics and cybersecurity firm, a fact I kept deliberately quiet, letting my fiancé and his family believe I was just a mid-level tech support manager. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart a toxic family who thought they could underestimate your worth. Trust me, you will want to hear how I turned my wedding day into a crime scene for their egos. The rehearsal dinner took place at a ridiculously overpriced restaurant in downtown Manhattan. Crystal chandeliers hung low over tables covered in heavy white linen. Liam, my fiancé, sat next to me looking incredibly handsome in his custom-tailored suit. He worked as an investment banker, or so I had been told, and his family paraded around the room like they owned all of Wall Street. His mother, Sylvia, sat across from us, swirling her expensive red wine and eyeing my simple silk dress with poorly concealed disgust. She had spent the entire last year making sure I knew I was an orphan with no pedigree. We were barely through the appetizers when Sylvia started her usual theatrical performance. She sighed loudly and looked at the other affluent guests seated at our table. It is just so noble of Liam to look past social class. Sylvia announced, her voice carrying easily over the gentle clinking of silver forks and crystal glasses. Most men in his position would require a wife with a proper family background, but Liam has such a charitable heart. Taking in someone who grew up with absolutely nothing, it is almost like a rescue mission for him. I kept my face perfectly blank and took a slow sip of sparkling water. I did not yell, I did not cry, I just watched Liam. Instead of defending me, he chuckled and patted my hand condescendingly. "Come on, Mom, play nice," he said, though his tone was entirely amused. He loved it. He loved playing the wealthy savior to my poor, unfortunate soul. What they did not know was that my company had just been valued at $45 million, and I had quietly paid for this entire dinner because Liam claimed his liquid funds were temporarily tied up in a complex portfolio. The dinner dragged on, turning into a suffocating marathon of veiled insults and arrogant boasting. Sylvia bragged loudly about their massive family estate in the Hamptons and complained about the high taxes burdening their generational wealth. I nodded politely, playing the role of the quiet, grateful bride. I suppose my silence gave them a false sense of security. They thought I was completely oblivious. They thought I was stupid. As the dessert plates were being cleared away, Sylvia leaned much closer to Liam. She completely ignored my presence and switched abruptly to Italian, assuming the uneducated orphan girl only knew English. She smirked and whispered, "She looks so incredibly cheap, but her signature tomorrow will save our house in the Hamptons." "Are you absolutely sure your lawyer slipped the cross-ownership clause into the prenup?" Liam smirked back, sipping his dark espresso. He replied in Italian, "Do not worry, Mom. A full 50% of her tech company will be mine the second we exchange rings." She is far too stupid to have her own lawyer read the final draft. My blood turned to ice, but my heart beat with a terrifying, steady rhythm. The man I was supposed to marry in less than 12 hours had just admitted to forging a legal document to steal half of my life work. They needed my hidden wealth to save their fake empire. I carefully placed my linen napkin on the table and stood up. I walked around the table to Sylvia. I smiled warmly, reaching out and grabbing her right hand. I squeezed her fingers together with a sudden, crushing grip. Her smug expression vanished instantly, replaced by a sharp gasp of pain. "The pasta tonight was excellent, Sylvia. I whispered down to her in flawless, unaccented Italian. Enjoy it because this will be the very last expensive meal you will not have to wash dishes to pay for. I let go of her hand. Sylvia sat frozen in her chair, her face completely drained of color. Liam dropped his espresso cup, the dark liquid spilling all over the pristine white tablecloth. His jaw went slack as he stared at me in absolute horror. They were completely paralyzed. I did not say another word to either of them. I turned my back and walked out of the restaurant, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. I stepped out into the crisp New York night air and got straight into a waiting car. I did not shed a single tear. As the car pulled away from the curb, I reached into my leather bag and pulled out my encrypted laptop. The screen illuminated the dark back seat. My fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing security firewalls and accessing my company servers. If Liam wanted to play a game of corporate espionage and financial ruin, he had just challenged the wrong woman. The cyber hunt had begun, and I was going to burn his entire life to the ground. My phone began buzzing the second I stepped into my hotel suite. The caller ID flashed Liam, accompanied by a picture of us smiling on a beach in Malibu. It was an image of pure, fabricated happiness. I tossed my keys onto the glass coffee table, took a slow, deep breath to steady my racing pulse, and answered the call. I made sure to let my voice tremble just a little bit, perfectly mimicking the sound of an overwhelmed, insecure bride. Liam, I answered softly, keeping my tone submissive. Babe, what was that back there? He demanded, his voice thick with fake concern and a heavy layer of condescension. He was already launching into full gaslighting mode. You completely overreacted at the restaurant. Your Italian is seriously rusty, Nora. Mom was not talking about a prenup or stealing your company. She was just saying you look pretty in your dress and that she hopes the wedding goes smoothly. You embarrassed her in front of everyone. I sat down at the mahogany desk in the corner of the suite and flipped open my laptop. The sleek black machine hummed to life instantly. I murmured into the phone, letting out a perfectly timed sigh of manufactured guilt. I am so sorry, Liam. The wedding planning has me so stressed out. I must have completely misheard the translation. My head has been spinning all day long. Please tell Sylvia I apologize for my erratic behavior. As I fed his massive ego with those pathetic apologies, my fingers were already flying across the keyboard. Liam had no idea who he was truly dealing with. 6 months ago, he complained that his laptop was running slowly and asked me to fix it, assuming my tech support job meant I just cleared browser caches. While I was pretending to clean his hard drive, I had quietly installed a deep-root backdoor into his entire digital ecosystem. Oh, do not worry about it, babe, Liam replied smoothly, clearly relieved that I had backed down so quickly. His voice shifted back to that arrogant, confident tone he loved to use. You just focus on getting your beauty sleep. Tomorrow is going to be the absolute best day of our lives. We are going to build a massive future together. Just rest your head. I will handle everything from here. You are so good to me, Liam, I said sweetly. I will see you at the altar. I ended the call and tossed my phone onto the bed. The helpless bride act was officially over. On my laptop screen, my company master dashboard booted up. The glowing interface did not display a mid-level corporate salary. In stark, crisp numbers, the dashboard displayed the current market valuation of my sole proprietorship: $45 million. I had built a data forensics empire from a cramped dorm room while Liam was busy failing out of a prestigious finance firm. I specialized in tracking hidden offshore assets for corporate clients, breaking through military-grade firewalls and exposing financial fraud. Liam trying to hide secrets from me was like a toddler trying to hide a stolen toy from a seasoned private detective. I initiated a secure proxy chain routing my connection through servers in Switzerland and Singapore. Within 30 seconds, I pinged Liam's personal phone and his encrypted iCloud account. He thought his two-factor authentication would protect him. He was incredibly wrong. Because I had administrative access to his telecommunications provider, I intercepted the 6-digit security code before it even flashed on his phone screen. Access granted. The screen flooded with his private digital life. Text messages, bank statements, deleted emails, and browsing history all laid bare before my eyes. I bypassed the useless clutter of his group chats with his groomsmen and ignored his pathetic attempts at flirting with random women on social media. I was not looking for petty infidelity. I was hunting for the financial guillotine he and his mother were preparing to drop on my neck. I ran a rapid keyword search across his entire cloud drive. I typed in terms like equity transfer cross-ownership and Hampton's estate. The system processed the massive amount of data in mere seconds. A series of hidden subfolders materialized on my screen, buried deep within a directory he had deceitfully labeled as gym routines. My eyes narrowed as I clicked the mouse. The encrypted barrier dissolved instantly under my decryption software. Right at the top of the directory was a highly classified folder that made my blood run absolutely cold. It was titled Legal Drafts Modified just 48 hours ago. I leaned closer to the bright screen, my heart pounding with a deadly calculated rhythm. It was time to see exactly how Liam planned to rob me blind. I clicked on the folder and a list of document files populated the screen. They were all labeled with my name followed by various version numbers of our prenuptial agreement. I selected the final document, the one time-stamped just 2 days ago, and opened it. Then I split my computer monitor in half. On the left side of the screen, I pulled up the original prenuptial agreement that my own attorney had drafted. On the right side, I displayed the final version Liam had submitted to his legal team for the official public registry. At first glance, the documents looked identical. I ran a specialized text comparison algorithm that I had coded myself, instructing the software to highlight any discrepancies between the two files in bright red. Pages 1 through 14 remained stark white. They contained the standard legal jargon we had verbally agreed upon. They outlined the protection of our individual premarital assets, confirmed that our banking accounts would remain completely separate, and explicitly waived any right to spousal support in the event of a divorce. Everything appeared perfectly normal and fair. Then the algorithm reached page 15. The entire right side of my screen lit up in glaring, aggressive red. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the altered text. Page 15 was the signature page. On my original document, this section contained a very simple, ironclad clause, solidifying my absolute 100% ownership of my cybersecurity firm, along with all its intellectual property and future valuations. On Liam's submitted version, that protective clause had been completely erased. In its place was a dense paragraph of legal manipulation that made my stomach physically churn. The new clause explicitly stated that Liam was recognized as a vital co-founder of my company. It falsely claimed that he had provided crucial sweat equity initial seed funding and strategic corporate consulting during the inception of the business. Therefore, the document legally mandated that upon the official certification of our marriage, Liam would automatically be granted an irrevocable 50% equity stake in my entire enterprise. I stared at the screen, letting the magnitude of his deception wash over me. I started this company in a cramped college dorm room, surviving on cheap noodles and sleeping 4 hours a night. I built the firewalls, I wrote the code, and I secured the corporate contracts. Liam had never written a single line of code in his life. He barely knew how to restart his own wireless router. Yet here he was, legally declaring himself the architect of my life's work. I zoomed in on the signatures at the very bottom of the forged page. There was Liam's signature written in his usual arrogant, sweeping cursive, and right below it was my signature. Except I had absolutely never signed this version of the contract. My mind flashed back to the day we finalized the paperwork at his lawyer's upscale office in Midtown. I remembered Liam being overly attentive that morning. He had insisted on fetching me an expensive latte, distracting me with a long romantic story about the private villa he had booked for our honeymoon in Greece. While my attention was divided, he must have smoothly slipped this counterfeit page 15 into the thick stack of papers right before I put my pen to the paper. He literally forged a binding legal contract to steal $22.5 million from me. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This entire relationship from the very first date had been a calculated, predatory lie. Every expensive bouquet of roses, every romantic dinner reservation, and every sweet text message had merely been a business expense to him. He did not want a wife to build a family with. He wanted a massive financial bailout. He viewed our upcoming wedding not as a union of two people in love, but as a hostile corporate takeover. Sylvia's smug, condescending face at the restaurant suddenly made perfect sense. She knew her golden boy was orchestrating a massive financial heist, and she was eagerly waiting to spend the spoils of my hard work. A normal bride would have collapsed onto the hotel room floor in a puddle of tears. A normal woman would have called her best friend, crying hysterically, or perhaps stormed over to the groom's suite to confront him screaming and throwing heavy objects. I did none of those things. I leaned back in my ergonomic desk chair, crossed my arms, and let out a short, cold laugh that echoed in the quiet room. The sheer audacity of his plan was almost impressive if it had not been so incredibly reckless. He actually believed his superficial charm and expensive suits could outsmart a woman who spent her entire professional career dismantling complex international cyber fraud syndicates. But as I stared at his forged signature, a new, far more dangerous question began to form in my mind. Liam was deeply arrogant, but he was also incredibly lazy. Orchestrating a legal forgery of this magnitude required a desperate, frantic level of motivation that I had never noticed in him before. Why would a supposedly highly successful, wealthy investment banker need to steal 50% of my company so urgently? What kind of massive financial disaster was he hiding in the dark shadows of his own life? I closed the legal folder with a sharp click of my mouse. I pivoted my investigation away from the prenuptial agreement and targeted his personal banking records. If he wanted to play a dirty game of financial ruin, I was going to unearth every single skeleton he had buried in his backyard. I opened his financial portfolio interface, ready to follow the money. The banking application loaded on my screen, but it did not display the robust mutual funds and blue-chip stocks Liam constantly bragged about at dinner parties. Instead, I found a digital graveyard. His primary checking account had a balance of exactly $3,800. For a man who casually dropped $2,000 on a bespoke Italian suit just last week, this made absolutely no sense. I bypassed his standard retail banking app and dug much deeper into the institutional clearinghouse servers, tracing his social security number to a supposedly dormant brokerage account. The security firewalls here were slightly more sophisticated, requiring me to run a specialized decryption script that took an agonizing 2 minutes to crack. When the screen finally refreshed, the truth slapped me across the face. Liam had not voluntarily left his prestigious position at the investment bank to pursue independent venture capital, as he had proudly announced to my friends and colleagues. I pulled his official termination letter, which had been buried in a compressed file on a backup server. He had been unceremoniously fired exactly 6 months ago. The corporate compliance department had caught him orchestrating an incredibly sloppy insider trading scheme. They had forced his immediate resignation and threatened federal prosecution if he ever attempted to trade on their floor again. His career on Wall Street was completely dead. But the shameful termination was just the tip of the financial iceberg. I navigated to his active trading ledger to see what he had been doing since he lost his job. Liam had developed a severe gambling addiction. Only his casino of choice was the volatile options market. He had heavily leveraged himself into high-risk, short-term tech derivatives, borrowing heavily against assets he did not actually own. When the tech market experienced a sudden correction last quarter, his entire portfolio had been brutally liquidated. He was not just broke. He was buried alive under a mountain of debt. A glaring red notification blinked relentlessly at the top of the dashboard. It was an active margin call from a notoriously aggressive New York hedge fund. Liam owed them exactly $3.2 million. The debt was currently in default. How does a disgraced, unemployed banker keep a $3 million corporate shark off his back for 6 months? He offers heavy collateral. I cross-referenced the hedge fund lien records with the New York Public Property Registry. My jaw tightened as the official documents populated on my screen. The glorious Hamptons estate, the crown jewel of Sylvia and her fabricated high society image, the sprawling summer house she never stopped bragging about to anyone who would listen, was no longer truly theirs. Liam had secretly used a forged power of attorney to collateralize his mother-family home. The ruthless hedge fund now held the primary deed to the property, and because Liam had entirely missed his last 3 massive penalty payments, the legal grace period was completely over. The estate was scheduled for absolute foreclosure in exactly 48 hours. By Monday morning, Sylvia would be officially locked out of her own mansion. The realization washed over me cold and sharp. No wonder Sylvia was suddenly willing to play along with the wedding. No wonder she suddenly overlooked my lack of aristocratic pedigree and forced a smile during the engagement party. They were entirely destitute. My $45 million company was their absolute only lifeboat. Liam desperately needed my equity to liquidate enough fast cash to pay off the angry hedge fund, save his mother house from the auction block, and avoid federal prison for the forged collateral documents. I was nothing but a sacrificial lamb to slaughter on the altar of their extreme financial incompetence. I leaned back in my chair, taking a slow sip of cold water from the hotel mini-fridge, processing the sheer magnitude of his pathetic failure. But one small detail still bothered my analytical mind. If Liam had absolutely no steady income for the past 6 months, and the margin call was compounding heavy daily interest, how had he managed to keep the hedge fund from foreclosing on the house last month? I scanned the incoming transaction history for his primary checking account over the past 30 days. There it was, a massive, inexplicable influx of cash. Exactly $500,000 had been wired into his checking account exactly 2 weeks ago, serving as a temporary penalty payment to keep the corporate wolves at bay. I quickly traced the bank routing number, fully expecting to see a high-interest loan from a desperate friend or a shady offshore lender. Instead, the screen displayed a domestic joint checking account. The account belonged to his sister, Diana. Diana, the perpetually unemployed, highly entitled sister who spent her days complaining about the service at luxury boutiques and pretending to be a lifestyle influencer. She had absolutely no personal income. So how did she manage to wire $500,000 of liquid cash into her brother's checking account on a random Tuesday afternoon? I did not even have to run a complex algorithm to figure this one out. I simply pulled the wire authorization records and traced the origin of the funds. The money had been drained directly from a high-yield savings account shared by Diana and her husband Jamal. Jamal was the exact opposite of the parasites he had married into. He was a brilliant African-American trauma surgeon at one of the top hospitals in the city. While Liam and Sylvia spent their days scheming and pretending to be American royalty, Jamal was working grueling 80-hour shifts, standing on his feet in the operating room, literally pulling people back from the brink of death. He was warm, genuine, and always treated me with profound respect. During family dinners, while Sylvia made passive-aggressive jabs at my background, Jamal was the only one who actually asked about my day and listened with sincere interest. He was a good man, and his wife was currently robbing him blind. I dug deeply into the transaction history of their joint savings account. According to the internal banking memos attached to the file, this specific fund was entirely designated as a down payment for a new house. Jamal had been saving that money for over 5 years, working endless overtime shifts and sacrificing his own physical health to buy a beautiful home in the suburbs where they could finally start a family. Diana had wiped it out in a single keystroke. She had forged Jamal's digital signature to bypass the dual authorization security protocol at their bank, funneling his hard-earned money straight into Liam's failing portfolio, just to keep the hedge fund from taking Sylvia's house. I remembered the dark circles under Jamal's eyes at the rehearsal dinner just hours ago. He had arrived late, apologizing profusely because an emergency trauma surgery had run long. He had looked utterly exhausted, yet he still managed to bring an expensive bottle of wine for Liam. Meanwhile, Diana had spent the entire evening rolling her eyes and complaining that he was not paying enough attention to her designer outfit. The contrast between his exhausted dedication and her shallow entitlement made me feel physically sick. She was actively bleeding him dry. Diana was committing federal wire fraud. If the bank ever audited the transaction and flagged the mismatched IP addresses during the authorization process, she could face serious prison time. But she clearly did not care. The family's fake image was more important than her husband's trust or her own freedom. She probably rationalized the theft by telling herself that Liam would pay it all back the second he got his hands on my company. They were treating my hard-earned millions like a guaranteed family slush fund. The sheer depravity of this family was staggering. It was not just Liam acting alone. It was a coordinated, multi-generational criminal enterprise disguised as a high society family. Sylvia demanded the luxury lifestyle. Liam committed financial fraud to maintain the illusion. And when Liam failed, Diana swooped in to steal from her unsuspecting husband to cover their tracks. They were all in on it. They were a pack of well-dressed vultures, and Jamal and I were their chosen prey. They viewed outsiders not as human beings, but as bank accounts waiting to be drained. I sat back in the dim glow of the computer screen, feeling a cold, righteous fury settling deep into my bones. Liam thought he could trap me with a forged prenuptial agreement. He thought he could secure his 50% equity payoff, his $3 million margin debt refund, the stolen $500,000 to Jamal before the poor surgeon ever noticed it was missing, and then live happily ever after on my dime. He thought he was the smartest person in the room. He was about to learn a catastrophic lesson in modern corporate warfare. I closed the financial ledgers and completely wiped my digital footprints from the bank servers. I left absolutely no trace of my intrusion. I wanted Liam to walk into that church tomorrow feeling like a king. I wanted him standing at the altar, surrounded by his snobby friends and his toxic family, completely certain that he had won the ultimate prize. Because the higher you elevate a narcissist, the harder they shatter when you finally cut the cord. I glanced down at the glowing digital clock on the bottom corner of my screen. It was exactly 2 o'clock in the morning. Outside the hotel window, the streets of Manhattan were quiet, wrapped in the stillness of the early morning hours. I had exactly 12 hours until the ceremony was scheduled to begin. 12 hours to dismantle a fraud, protect my empire, and prepare a spectacular execution for the parasite who thought he could steal my life. I reached for my cell phone, bypassing Liam's missed calls and frantic text messages. I scrolled through my encrypted contact list and pressed the call button for my lead corporate attorney. It was time to initiate the poison pill. The phone rang only twice before a groggy voice answered on the other end. Gregory was the most ruthless corporate attorney in Manhattan, and he billed $1,000 an hour precisely because he answered my calls at 2 o'clock in the morning. I did not bother with pleasantries. I told him to wake up, his entire legal team get out his secure laptop, and prepare for a hostile asset restructuring. I explained exactly what Liam had done. I told him about the forged signature on the 15th page of the prenuptial agreement, the hidden margin call, and the incoming foreclosure on the Hamptons estate. Gregory was wide awake by the time I finished my second sentence. A forged prenuptial agreement is a severe federal offense, Gregory said, his voice now sharp and completely alert over the encrypted line. We can have him arrested before the sun comes up. We can cancel the wedding right now and file for a massive restraining order to protect your financial safety. I paced across the thick carpet of the hotel suite, looking out at the glittering city lights. No, I replied evenly. Canceling the wedding gives him a chance to run away. It gives Sylvia a chance to spin the narrative, to cry to her high society friends and play the victim. They view my company as a giant piggy bank waiting to be cracked open. I want to leave them with a completely empty vault. We are initiating the midnight poison pill protocol right now. Gregory went silent for a moment, processing the magnitude of my demand. The poison pill was an extreme corporate defense strategy we had theorized about when I first founded the company. It was originally designed to prevent hostile takeovers from aggressive tech giants. It involved instantly liquidating all my vulnerable personal assets and transferring my entire 100% equity stake into an irrevocable blind trust. Once the transfer was complete, I would legally own nothing. I would not have direct access to the capital, I could not independently sell the corporate shares, and absolutely no one could sue me for them or claim them in a fraudulent marriage. Nora, if we execute this protocol tonight, there is absolutely no going back, Gregory warned. You are locking away $45 million in a matter of hours. The legal unspooling alone will take years if you ever want direct ownership again. By 8 o'clock this morning, your net worth on paper will literally be zero. You will be entirely dependent on the trust administrators. That is exactly the point, I said, staring at my reflection in the dark glass of the hotel window. Liam forged a legal contract to steal half of my net worth. He is banking everything on that specific number. I want his prize to be exactly half of nothing. Protect the company. I heard the rapid clicking of a keyboard over the speakerphone as Gregory began drafting the emergency transfer documents. He woke up his junior partners and his offshore financial contacts. Within an hour, they had established the framework for a high-security trust in a jurisdiction that did not recognize domestic civil claims or marital property disputes. I signed the electronic authorizations, watching my massive personal wealth evaporate from my domestic accounts and funnel directly into the impenetrable fortress of the blind trust. By 8 o'clock in the morning, right as the hotel staff began setting up the beautiful floral arrangements for the ceremony downstairs, my financial footprint would completely vanish. I was legally broke. If Liam tried to enforce his fraudulent contract, he would be claiming 50% of an entity that no longer existed under my name. His plan was dead in the water. But simply protecting my assets was not enough for me. Defense is for people who just want to survive a battle. I wanted absolute annihilation. I poured myself another glass of cold water and sat back down at my desk, pulling up the hedge fund information I had scraped from Liam's computer just an hour ago. Gregory, there is one more thing before you log off and get dressed, I said, my voice dropping to a low whisper. Liam owes exactly $3.2 million to a corporate hedge fund called Apex Capital. They hold the primary lien on his mother's estate in the Hamptons, and they are preparing to foreclose in less than 48 hours. I want you to contact the senior partners at Apex Capital the absolute second the market opens this morning. I heard Gregory take a slow breath. What exactly do you want me to tell them when I call? I smiled in the empty hotel room. They are holding highly toxic debt from a disgraced banker who cannot pay them back. Offer to buy Liam's entire debt portfolio for cash right now at a slight premium if you have to. Use the emergency corporate slush fund we keep outside the new trust. I do not just want to block his attempt to steal my money. I want to buy his debt. I want to own the lien on his mother's house. I want to be his sole legally binding creditor by the time I walk down that aisle. Gregory let out a low whistle of pure professional admiration. Consider it done, Nora. Happy wedding day. Consider it done, Nora. Happy wedding day. Gregory spoke those final words before ending the call, and the line went silent just as the first rays of morning sunlight broke over the Manhattan skyline. By 9 o'clock that morning, I was sitting in the center of the sprawling bridal suite, at the venue, a glass of sparkling water in my hand. My makeup artist was carefully applying the finishing touches to my eyeliner. I looked perfectly serene. Nobody could tell that I had spent the entire night dismantling a corporate fraud scheme and securing a $3 million hedge fund debt. My phone pinged once with a secure message from Gregory. The trust transfer was completely finalized and the debt acquisition paperwork was officially in my name. The trap was perfectly set. The heavy oak door of the bridal suite swung open without a single knock. Sylvia and Diana marched into the room bringing a suffocating cloud of heavy designer perfume with them. They carried themselves like royalty, gracing a peasant with their presence. Sylvia wore an overly elaborate silver gown that looked more appropriate for a red carpet gala than a morning wedding, while Diana paraded around in a tight silk dress that clearly cost more than her stolen savings account. Sylvia did not offer a polite greeting. She immediately walked over to where my custom Vera Wang wedding dress was hanging by the grand window. She reached out and rubbed the delicate silk fabric between her fingers, her face twisting into a mask of polite disappointment. "It is very simple, Nora," Sylvia said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "I suppose it reflects your modest upbringing perfectly. We are just used to things with a bit more grandeur for our family standards, but I am sure Liam will pretend to love it." Diana snickered from the velvet couch, crossing her legs and inspecting her fresh manicure. "You really should have let us pick out the dress, Nora," Diana chimed in lazily. "We have an image to maintain today. Half the city elite will be sitting in those pews. We cannot have you looking like you bought your gown off a discount rack." I kept my expression entirely placid, letting the makeup artist continue her work. I did not take the bait. I knew exactly why they were suddenly so aggressive this morning. The clock was ticking on their foreclosure, and the sheer panic of their impending financial doom was leaking through their arrogant facades. They needed to assert dominance over the woman they were planning to rob. Sylvia walked over to my vanity table and aggressively dropped a thick manila envelope right next to my cosmetics. She tapped her manicured fingernails against the paper, giving me a tight, demanding smile. "Since you are just sitting here doing nothing, we have one final piece of minor housekeeping to take care of," Sylvia announced smoothly. "Liam Financial Advisors sent over a very standard banking proxy. It is just a routine procedural document to streamline the consolidation of your bank accounts with his after the ceremony. It will save you both a trip to the bank on Monday. I brought a pen so you can sign it right now and we can get it out of the way." She pulled an expensive fountain pen from her clutch and held it out to me. Her eyes were wide and intensely focused, betraying the desperate clawing greed hiding just beneath her expensive makeup. She was lying right to my face. I knew exactly what was inside that envelope. It was an emergency power of attorney document designed to give Liam immediate access to my liquid cash the absolute second the wedding concluded, bypassing any standard banking delays. They needed my money today before the hedge fund seized their precious house. I looked at the envelope, then slowly looked up at Sylvia, expectant, demanding face. I did not reach for the pen. Instead, I raised my hand and elegantly pushed her wrist away. "I would love to sign it, Sylvia," I said, keeping my voice bright and enthusiastically naive. "But my makeup is almost done and my hands are slightly shaking from all the wedding nerves. Plus, my photographer told me he wants to capture a beautiful, candid moment of Liam and me signing our official documents at the altar. It will make such a wonderful memory for the wedding album. I will sign your banking proxy right there at the altar along with the marriage license. For the photographer." Sylvia froze, her hand still hovering in the air. A flash of genuine panic crossed her eyes. She looked back at Diana, who suddenly stopped admiring her nails and sat up straight. "Well," Sylvia stammered, trying to regain her composure. "That is highly irregular, Nora. Liam needs this paperwork filed with the attorneys immediately after the ceremony." "And he will have it," I replied sweetly, flashing her a perfect camera-ready smile, "right at the altar. What could possibly be more romantic than blending our lives together in front of all your high society friends?" Sylvia stared at me, her jaw tightly clenched. She desperately wanted to force the pen into my hand, but she could not risk causing a massive scene and blowing the entire operation just hours before the payout. She swallowed her frustration and forced a stiff, unnatural smile. "Fine," Sylvia agreed uneasily, snatching the pen back. "At the altar, then. Do not forget, Nora. Liam is counting on you." She turned on her heel and marched out of the suite, Diana trailing closely behind her like a loyal henchman. The heavy door clicked shut. I looked back at my reflection in the mirror. Liam was definitely counting on me, and I was going to deliver a performance they would never forget. Just as I settled back into my chair to let the makeup artist finish her work, a gentle knock sounded at the heavy oak door. It was a stark contrast to the aggressive entrance Sylvia had made just moments ago. The door opened slowly, and Jamal stepped into the suite. He was wearing a sharply tailored charcoal suit, but the exhaustion etched into his face was impossible to hide. Deep, dark circles shadowed his kind brown eyes, a clear sign of the grueling 80-hour hospital shifts he had been pulling all week. Despite his fatigue, he offered me a warm, genuine smile and held out a stunning custom bouquet of white orchids and blue hydrangeas. "I wanted to come give you these before the madness of the ceremony begins," Jamal said, his voice a comforting rumble in the quiet room. "You look absolutely beautiful, Nora. Liam is a very lucky man. I just wanted to welcome you to the family properly." I felt a sharp pang of genuine guilt looking at him. Jamal was the only innocent casualty in the war I was about to wage. He had spent years working himself to the bone to provide for a woman who viewed him as nothing more than an endless ATM. I took the beautiful flowers from his hands, genuinely touched by the gesture. "Thank you, Jamal," I replied softly. "That really means the world to me." Before Jamal could say another word, the suite door swung open violently. Diana marched back into the room, her eyes instantly locking onto her husband. The fake aristocratic smile she had worn earlier was completely gone, replaced by a vicious scowl. "What are you doing in here, bothering the bride?" Diana snapped, crossing her arms over her expensive silk dress. "And more importantly, where is the velvet box from the jeweler? Please do not tell me you showed up empty-handed." Jamal stiffened, his broad shoulders dropping slightly. He glanced apologetically at me and my makeup artist, before turning to his wife, lowering his voice to keep the argument private. "Diana, we talked about this last night," he said calmly, though the strain in his voice was obvious. "I am not buying Liam a $10,000 Rolex for a wedding gift. It is completely absurd. We simply cannot afford a luxury watch right now, especially when we are supposed to be finalizing the down payment for our house next month." The sheer audacity of her demanding a $10,000 watch while secretly draining $500,000 from his savings account made my blood boil. Diana scoffed loudly, not caring at all that she was making a scene. "Cannot afford it," she mocked, rolling her eyes dramatically. "You are a highly respected trauma surgeon, Jamal. Stop acting like we are living in poverty. My brother deserves the best on his wedding day. It is a matter of respect and family image. All of his groomsmen are gifting him luxury items, and my husband is going to be the only one handing over a cheap paper check. It is completely humiliating for me." Jamal rubbed the bridge of his nose, looking utterly defeated by a conversation he had clearly endured 100 times before. "Diana, my paycheck does not stretch to infinity," he reasoned gently. "I am working as many extra shifts as the hospital will legally allow. We agreed the house was our priority. I wrote Liam a very generous check for $2,000. That is more than enough." "$2,000 is an absolute joke," Diana hissed, stepping closer to him, her voice dripping with toxic entitlement. "You know how much my family values appearances. I gave up a lot of my own potential to support your medical career, Jamal. The least you could do is make sure my brother is properly honored. I swear, sometimes I wonder why I married a man who refuses to understand the basic standards of my lifestyle." The air in the room grew heavy and incredibly uncomfortable. The makeup artist pretended to be intensely focused on her eyeshadow palette, trying to become invisible. Jamal looked down at the floor, swallowing hard. The vibrant, warm man who had walked into the room just moments ago was completely gone, crushed under the weight of his wife, relentless gold digger mentality. He was a brilliant doctor who saved lives daily, yet she made him feel like an absolute failure, simply because he would not fund her family's superficial vanity. "I am sorry," Nora, Jamal said quietly, not looking up. "I did not mean to bring this drama into your bridal suite. I will see you at the ceremony." He turned around, his posture sagging, and began to walk toward the door. I could not let him walk away feeling completely worthless. I knew exactly what was coming for him in a few hours, and I needed him to be ready. I stood up quickly, ignoring the makeup artist's protest, and walked over to him. "Wait, Jamal," I called out, reaching into the small pocket of my silk bridal robe. I pulled out a small piece of hotel stationery that I had folded tightly into a square. Diana watched me with narrowed, suspicious eyes. I completely ignored her. I grabbed Jamal's right hand and firmly pressed the folded piece of paper into his palm, closing his fingers around it. "Thank you again for the beautiful flowers," I said, looking directly into his tired eyes. "And Jamal, please, read this when you get to your seat. Keep your phone unmuted during the vows. Trust me." Jamal looked confused, but he nodded slowly, slipping the note into his suit pocket. He walked out of the room, leaving Diana standing there glaring at me with open hostility. I simply smiled, walked back to my chair, and told the makeup artist I was ready for my lipstick. The final piece of the puzzle was perfectly in place. While I sat perfectly still, letting the makeup artist apply a bold crimson lipstick across the manicured courtyard of the luxury estate Liam was living in an entirely different reality. In the sprawling groom suite, the air was thick with the heavy aroma of expensive cigars and the sharp scent of 20-year-old single malt scotch. Liam stood by a massive marble fireplace, a crystal tumbler in his hand, holding court among his 4 groomsmen. They were all former colleagues from the investment bank men who still wore custom-tailored suits and acted like they owned the financial world, even though most of them were drowning in hidden debt just like he was. "To the greatest acquisition of my entire career," Liam announced loudly, raising his glass of scotch high into the air. The groomsmen cheered, clinking their glasses together in a chorus of arrogant laughter. They did not know the full extent of his legal forgery, but they knew exactly why he was marrying me. He had spent the last 6 months bragging to them about how he was reeling in a naive tech nerd who had stumbled into a $45 million gold mine. To Liam, I was not a human being. I was an uneducated, lucky orphan who needed a sophisticated banker to manage her sudden wealth. He truly believed he was doing me a favor by taking 50% of my company. "You really pulled it off, man," one of the groomsmen chuckled, slapping Liam hard on the back. "I honestly thought you were going to lose the Hamptons house when you got let go from the firm. But here you are marrying a walking ATM machine. Just make sure you keep her on a tight leash once the accounts are merged." "Oh, she will not be a problem," Liam smirked, taking a long sip of his drink. "She is completely obsessed with me. She barely even looked at the prenup before she signed it. By tomorrow morning, my financial portfolio will be completely bulletproof, and I will be sitting on the board of directors of her little computer company." Despite his confident words and the arrogant smirk plastered across his face, a cold knot of severe anxiety was twisting tight in his stomach. The margin call from the Apex Capital hedge fund was a ticking time bomb, and the absolute deadline for foreclosure was tomorrow. He needed the liquid cash from my accounts the very second the priest pronounced us husband and wife. Liam excused himself from the loud group and walked over to the private balcony overlooking the pristine golf course. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket, his hands slightly trembling from the adrenaline and the lingering fear of federal prison. He opened his secure messaging app and quickly typed a message to his mother. "Is the proxy signed? I need to know the bank transfer is ready to initiate immediately after the reception." He stared at the screen, watching the typing indicator bubble, pop up, disappear, and pop up again. Every single second felt like an eternity. If I had refused to sign the banking proxy, his entire timeline would be destroyed. The hedge fund would seize the Hamptons estate before Monday morning, and his massive financial fraud would be exposed to his entire high society social circle. Finally, Sylvia's reply appeared on the screen. She refused to sign it in the room, said her hands were shaking from wedding nerves. Liam's heart skipped a beat. Panic flared in his chest, hot and sharp. He immediately started typing a frantic reply, ready to storm across the courtyard and demand that I sign the document right that second. But before his thumb could hit the send button, A second message from Sylvia flashed onto the screen. She said she will do it at the altar instead. She wants the wedding photographer to capture the moment we sign the marriage license and the proxy together. Do not worry. The idiot suspects absolutely nothing. She is just being a typical emotional bride obsessed with pictures. Liam let out a massive, shuddering breath of relief. He closed his eyes and leaned his head back against the cool glass of the balcony door. At the altar. Of course she wanted to do it at the altar. It was so perfectly pathetic and entirely in character for the weak romantic woman he thought I was. Signing the banking proxy in front of 300 guests would actually work in his favor. It would make the financial transfer look like a beautiful public display of total marital trust. It was the perfect cover for his crime. He locked his phone and slipped it back into his pocket, his arrogant confidence fully restored. He walked back into the suite and walked straight over to the full-length mirror. He carefully slipped his arms into his custom tuxedo jacket, adjusting the lapels with absolute precision. He straightened his black bow tie and shot himself a winning, predatory smile in the mirror. He fully believed he had just pulled off the greatest financial heist of his life. He was ready to claim his prize. At exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the heavy wooden doors of the historic cathedral swung open. A hushed silence fell over the 300 guests seated in the polished mahogany pews. The golden afternoon light filtered through the massive stained glass windows, casting vibrant colors across the marble floor. A string quartet positioned near the front of the church began to play a slow, elegant classical piece. It was the perfect, picturesque setting for a high society wedding. It was exactly the expensive illusion Sylvia had demanded to prove her family superiority. I stepped into the grand entryway completely alone. I had no father to walk me down the aisle, a fact Sylvia had loudly lamented for months. She claimed it was embarrassing for the family image to have a bride walk unaccompanied. But as I stood there in my simple silk gown, I felt absolute power. I did not need anyone to give me away. I was the sole owner of my destiny. I had built a technology empire from nothing with my own hands, and I was about to dismantle their generational wealth with a single devastating blow. I took my first step forward, my dress brushing softly against the cold marble. As I began my slow procession, the quiet whispers of the high society guests rippled through the cavernous room. They did not even try to hide their condescending tones. To these wealthy elites, I was just a charity case who had somehow tricked a brilliant investment banker into marriage. I kept my chin held high, hearing every word they muttered. "Look at her dress," one older woman whispered to her husband with arrogant pity. "It is so terribly plain. Sylvia must be absolutely mortified to present her to their friends today." From the opposite side of the aisle, a man who sounded like one of Liam's arrogant banking friends chimed in. "He really is throwing his life away on a nobody," the man chuckled softly. "She is just a lucky orphan girl. Liam is practically rescuing her from a life of total mediocrity." I smiled softly to myself. Let them whisper. Let them pity the poor orphan girl. They were sitting in an expensive church, completely unaware that the groom they praised was a disgraced, unemployed fraud, drowning in $3 million of margin debt. They thought Liam was a wealthy savior descending from his pedestal. In reality, he was a desperate criminal trying to steal my hard-earned money just to keep himself out of a federal penitentiary. Halfway down the aisle, I spotted Sylvia sitting in the front row. She was wearing her ridiculous silver gown, sitting upright with a smug, victorious smile. Beside her sat Diana, looking incredibly bored as she checked her fresh manicure, probably planning her next shopping spree with the stolen $500,000. Right next to Diana was Jamal. His posture was rigid. He caught my eye for a brief second and gave a barely noticeable nod. He had read my secret note. His phone was sitting face up on his leg, unmuted and ready. The first pillar of their fake empire was primed to fall. I turned my attention back to the altar. Liam was standing next to the priest, looking like the picture-perfect groom. His custom tuxedo fit flawlessly. His hair was perfectly styled. As I drew closer, he gave me a warm, incredibly loving smile. It was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. His eyes softened into an expression of pure adoration. Anyone looking at him would believe he was staring at the absolute love of his life. But I knew the terrifying truth. Behind those charming eyes was a calculating predator waiting to cash a forged check. He was not looking at his future wife. He was looking at a $45 million bailout. He was looking at the woman he thought he had successfully tricked into signing away everything she had ever worked for. My heart did not flutter. I felt an overwhelming sense of calm clarity wash over me. The string quartet played the final sweeping notes as I finally reached the end of the long marble aisle. I stepped up to the front of the altar. The entire cathedral went completely silent, filled with breathless anticipation. Liam took a small step forward. His loving smile widened as he confidently reached out his hand to take mine, ready to begin the ceremony that would secure his financial salvation forever. I stopped moving entirely. I looked down at his outstretched hand, then slowly looked back up into his eyes. And I did not take his hand. Liam stared at my hands, resting firmly at my sides. A flicker of genuine confusion crossed his perfectly sculpted features. He let out a soft, nervous chuckle, leaning in slightly. "Come on, babe," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the fading music of the string quartet. "Everyone is looking at us. Give me your hand." I kept my gaze fixed on his face, my expression completely unreadable. "I am fine right here," I replied quietly. Thinking I was merely suffering from a severe case of stage fright, Liam masked his irritation with another forced, benevolent smile. He turned his attention to the priest, giving him a slight nod to proceed. The elderly priest cleared his throat, adjusting his reading glasses, and stepped up to the ornate wooden pulpit. He spread his arms wide, welcoming the hundreds of wealthy guests who had packed the cathedral. "Dearly beloved," the priest began, his deep voice echoing beautifully off the high vaulted ceilings. "We are gathered here today in the sight of God and the presence of these witnesses to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The words flowed over me like water. I tuned out the standard religious platitudes, focusing instead on the energy in the room. I could feel the heavy stares of Sylvia and Diana drilling into my back from the front row. They were sitting on the edge of their seats, practically vibrating with greedy anticipation. They were just minutes away from securing their $3 million bailout. Liam stood beside me, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride. He looked like a conqueror claiming his hard-won territory. He had completely let his guard down. The priest continued through the opening liturgy, his voice steady and rhythmic. The cathedral was completely silent, save for the occasional rustle of expensive silk and the soft coughs of the elite guests. Every single person in that room believed they were witnessing the pathetic climax of a gold digger successfully merging his life with a naive, wealthy victim. Then the priest reached the most critical juncture of the ceremony. He looked out over the massive congregation, his expression turning solemn and serious. "If anyone can show just cause why these two may not lawfully be joined together, let them speak now or forever hold their peace." A heavy, pregnant silence blanketed the church. It was the traditional pause, a mere formality that no one ever actually expected to be interrupted. I watched from the corner of my eye as Liam let out a slow, deeply satisfied breath. He relaxed his shoulders. He thought he had crossed the finish line. He thought his forged contract was permanently secured and his mother estate was officially saved. I let the silence stretch for exactly 3 more seconds. I wanted him to taste the absolute certainty of his victory. I wanted him to feel completely invincible. And then I opened my hands. I let my beautiful, expensive bouquet of white orchids and blue hydrangeas slip from my grasp. The flowers hit the solid marble floor with a sharp, echoing thud that sounded like a gunshot in the silent cathedral. The priest blinked in surprise, looking down at the scattered petals. Liam turned his head sharply toward me, his arrogant smile instantly vanishing, replaced by a look of sheer panic. Before anyone could process what was happening, I stepped forward. I moved past Liam, reached out, and firmly took the microphone straight from the hands of the startled priest. I turned to face the hundreds of wide-eyed guests, my posture perfectly straight, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "I object," I announced clearly, my voice booming through the massive speakers and bouncing off the stone walls. Total paralyzed shock gripped the room. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. "I object," I repeated smoothly, looking directly at Liam's horrified face. "Mostly because my groom has a scheduled appointment with the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation this afternoon, and I simply refuse to spend my honeymoon visiting a federal penitentiary." The cathedral absolutely erupted. It was not just a murmur, it was an explosive wave of loud gasps, shocked screams, and furious whispering. 300 high society guests lost their composure simultaneously. In the front row, Sylvia leaped to her feet, her face turning a violently pale shade of gray. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Diana dropped her designer clutch, her hands flying to her mouth in terror. Only Jamal remained perfectly still, his eyes locked onto the unfolding destruction just as I had instructed. Liam completely lost his carefully crafted aristocratic facade. The charming, wealthy investment banker vanished, leaving behind a desperate, cornered criminal. His face flushed dark red with absolute rage. "What the hell are you doing?" he hissed violently, lunging forward to grab my arm and rip the microphone away from my hands. "Are you crazy? Shut up!" But I was faster. I took a swift, calculated step backward, smoothly evading his aggressive grasp. With my free hand, I reached into the hidden seam pocket of my custom Vera Wang gown. My fingers closed around a small black remote control. I held it up for him to see, a cold, triumphant smile finally breaking across my face. The hunt was over. It was time for the execution. I pressed the single red button on the remote control. Behind the altar, the massive digital screen that Liam had rented to display our childhood photos suddenly hummed to life. Instead of a romantic montage of our beach vacations, the screen illuminated the entire cathedral with a stark, glaring white light. The heavy shadows in the church vanished instantly, exposing Liam perfectly under the bright glow of his own deception. On the left side of the towering display, the original prenuptial agreement drafted by my attorneys appeared. On the right side, the version Liam submitted was projected in massive, undeniable high definition. I had specifically programmed the presentation software to highlight the discrepancies. A bright red box materialized around page 15 of both documents. "Please direct your attention to the screen behind me," I instructed the crowd, my voice echoing with absolute authority through the microphone. "You are looking at two very different legal documents. The one on the left is the contract I actually signed, which protected the $45 million cybersecurity company I built from the ground up. The one on the right is the document Liam secretly submitted to the public registry just 48 hours ago." I clicked the remote again. The screen zoomed in so close that the forged signature was larger than Liam himself. "You will notice a very interesting new clause on his version." I continued casually pacing the altar, like a seasoned prosecutor in a federal courtroom. "It claims that he is the visionary co-founder of my business and entitles him to exactly 50% of my entire life work. The absolute second this ceremony concludes. It is a brilliant financial strategy, really. Except for the minor detail that it constitutes federal wire fraud and felony forgery." Liam stood completely frozen, his eyes darting frantically between me and the giant screen. Sweat began to bead on his forehead, ruining his perfectly styled hair. He opened his mouth to deny it, to claim it was a simple clerical error made by his legal team. But I was already one step ahead of his pathetic lies. I pressed the button a third time. A heavily encrypted email exchange popped up directly over the legal documents. It was sent from Liam's private account to his attorney, complete with irrefutable digital timestamps. I read his exact words aloud to the breathless audience. "Just slide the new page 15 into the stack. She is too obsessed with the wedding dresses and floral arrangements to read the final draft. She will not suspect a thing. A collective gasp echoed through the church. The high society guests, who had been whispering vicious insults about my modest background just minutes ago, were now staring at the golden boy of Wall Street with absolute horror and disgust. The beautiful illusion of the wealthy, benevolent groom rescuing the poor orphan girl shattered into a million irreversible pieces. He was not a savior. He was exposed as a common thief, wearing an expensive custom tuxedo. Liam reached for the microphone, his hands trembling violently. "Nora, please," he begged, his voice cracking with sheer panic and desperation. "This is a massive misunderstanding. You are taking this completely out of context. Turn the screen off right now. We can talk about this in private. Do not do this in front of all our friends and family." I took another calculated step back, keeping the microphone firmly in my grip. "We are well past the point of private conversations, Liam," I replied coldly, my voice cutting through his panic like a knife. "You wanted a massive public spectacle. You wanted all of your sophisticated friends to sit here and watch you claim your ultimate financial prize. I am simply giving you the grand audience you requested." In the front row, Sylvia finally snapped out of her paralyzed shock. The terrifying reality of her son being publicly exposed as a federal felon finally registered in her arrogant brain. She jumped up from her pew, her ridiculous silver dress rustling loudly in the quiet church. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger toward the back of the cathedral. "Somebody cut the power!" Sylvia shrieked, her voice completely hysterical and shrill. "Turn that projector screen off right this second. Call the venue manager. Cut the electricity to the entire building." A few of Liam's groomsmen immediately bolted down the center aisle, sprinting toward the audiovisual control room at the back of the church to shut down the main breaker. But they did not make it very far. As they reached the heavy oak doors of the control booth, four massive men wearing sharp black suits and discreet earpieces stepped out of the shadows. They crossed their arms, completely blocking the entrance like an impenetrable wall. I had hired a private corporate security firm for the day, and they were worth every single penny. "Do not bother Sylvia," I announced loudly, making sure every single person in the room heard me. "My security team has strict instructions. Nobody touches that control panel until I am finished presenting my evidence. And trust me, I am just getting started with the financial audit of this family." I turned my gaze away from the panicked groomsmen, struggling helplessly against my private security detail at the back of the church. I looked directly at the front rows of the cathedral. The elite guests, the same people who had just spent the last hour whispering about how incredibly lucky I was to be rescued from my modest upbringing, were now shifting uncomfortably in their expensive seats. The smug arrogance that had filled the room just moments ago had entirely evaporated. They were staring at Liam like he was a complete stranger. I locked eyes with Sylvia. She had sank back into the hard wooden pew, her face a mask of absolute terror. She finally realized I had bypassed her son's shallow lies and dug directly into the darkest core of her fabricated high society life. I pressed the button on my remote control for the fourth time. The image of the forged prenuptial agreement vanished from the massive projector screen behind me. It was immediately replaced by a highly detailed, officially stamped legal document from the New York Real Estate Registry. The bold red letters at the top of the page read, "Notice of Imminent Foreclosure." I used the remote to zoom in on the property address, making sure every single person sitting in those mahogany pews could clearly read the location. It was the exact address of Sylvia Precious heavily boasted about Hampton's estate, the crown jewel she constantly used to assert her dominance over everyone else. "Your entire high society family is completely bankrupt, Liam," I announced, my voice echoing sharply off the vaulted ceilings. I walked slowly down the altar steps, closing the distance between myself and the front row. I wanted to look down at them. Did you really think I would not run a comprehensive corporate background check on the man who was actively demanding half of my digital forensics empire? Let us talk about the real reason why you needed my money so desperately today. You were not stepping away from Wall Street to start your own venture capital firm. You were fired from your prestigious investment bank 6 months ago for severe insider trading violations. And instead of finding an honest job, you leveraged assets you did not own and lost absolutely everything in the options market. I looked out at the sea of wealthy guests, making sure to make eye contact with the women who had mocked my simple silk dress. You all thought Liam was doing charity work by marrying the poor orphan girl, I said smoothly, my tone dripping with icy satisfaction. But the truth is, he is drowning in a massive margin call from Apex Capital. He owes them exactly $3.2 million. And because he had absolutely no liquid cash left, he secretly used a forged power of attorney to use his mother-generational summer home as collateral. That massive house goes to a public bank auction in exactly 48 hours. You did not want a wife, Liam. You wanted a blind financial bailout. You needed my hard-earned capital to save your mother from being permanently locked out of her own home. The silence in the cathedral was absolute and suffocating. The wealthy elites stared at Sylvia. She was now covering her face with both of her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as she was utterly destroyed by the crushing public humiliation. Her fake empire was gone. The guests began murmuring loudly again, appalled by the complete lack of shame displayed by the groom. But Liam was not finished fighting. The sheer desperation of losing his multi-million-dollar prize pushed him completely over the edge of rational sanity. He could not accept that he had been outsmarted by the woman he considered completely beneath him. He lunged forward, his face twisted in manic, sweating rage, and grabbed the heavy base of the microphone stand. He yanked it toward his mouth, breathing heavily into the audio system. He was gripping the metal pole so tightly his knuckles were completely white. He looked like a cornered animal refusing to accept its inevitable fate. "It does not matter," Liam yelled into the microphone, his voice cracking with wild, delusional panic. "It does not matter what you show them up on that screen. By walking down this aisle today and participating in this ceremony, you have already established a binding verbal and physical commitment. We live together. My lawyers will argue common law asset merging. You wore the white dress. You stood at the altar in front of hundreds of witnesses. The intent to marry is legally documented. I still own half your company, Nora. You cannot just walk away with my money. I still own half your company, Nora. You cannot just walk away with my money." Liam screamed those words into the microphone, his chest heaving with desperate, ragged breaths. He truly believed his last-minute legal argument would save him. He thought he could bully me into compliance right there at the altar. I did not back away from his sudden outburst. I did not flinch. Instead, I tipped my head back and laughed. It was not a hysterical laugh. It was a chilling, triumphant sound that echoed through the massive cathedral, slicing through the heavy tension in the room. The sheer absurdity of his arrogance was almost poetic. He was a drowning man, trying to claim ownership of the ocean that was currently swallowing him whole. My laughter sent a visible shiver down Liam's spine. His manic rage faltered, replaced by a sudden creeping dread. He realized I was not acting like a woman who had just been trapped by a legal loophole. I was acting like a woman who had already won the war. I stopped laughing and looked him dead in the eyes. I reached into the hidden seam of my custom wedding gown one last time. I pulled out a single neatly folded piece of paper. It was not a prop. It was a certified financial transfer confirmation from my corporate attorney. I held the crisp white document up in the air, ensuring the bright cathedral lights caught the official gold seal pressed into the bottom corner. "You really should have updated your legal knowledge before attempting a corporate heist," Liam, I said smoothly, bringing the microphone back up to my lips. My voice was dangerously calm. Common law asset merging only applies to assets that actually exist under my name at the time the marriage is formalized. But you see, I woke up very early this morning. I made a very important phone call to my legal team at 3 o'clock. I took a slow step closer to him, forcing him to look directly at the paper in my hand. Check the public corporate registry, Liam. I instructed, my words falling like heavy stones into the silent church. As of 6 o'clock this morning, Nora Incorporated no longer exists under my personal portfolio. I executed an emergency poison pill protocol. I liquidated all my vulnerable domestic accounts and transferred my entire 100% equity stake into a highly secure, irrevocable blind trust located in an offshore jurisdiction. Liam stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a suffocating fish. His eyes darted frantically as his former banker brain desperately tried to process the financial maneuver I had just described. "Do you understand what that means?" I asked, leaning in slightly, so only he and the first few rows could see the absolute zero mercy in my eyes. "It means that my legal net worth on paper is exactly $0. I do not own the company anymore. The trust administrators own it. I have absolutely no domestic capital for you to claim. You spent the last 6 months planning a massive financial fraud. You risked a federal felony conviction to forge a contract. You dragged your mother and your friends into this pathetic illusion. And you did it all to steal exactly 50% of absolutely nothing." The words landed with the devastating force of a physical blow. The absolute finality of my statement shattered the last remaining pieces of his delusional confidence. The financial safety net he had relied on to save his mother's house and clear his massive hedge fund debt had completely vanished into thin air. He had played his final card, and he had still lost everything. Liam Legs simply gave out. The groom, the golden boy of his high society circle, collapsed right there on the pristine marble floor of the cathedral. He dropped to his knees, his expensive custom tuxedo crumpling around him. He stared blankly at the ground, his chest shuddering as the full weight of his impending financial ruin and legal prosecution crashed down on his shoulders. He was completely broken. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the arrogant investment banker sobbed quietly at the altar. It was a pathetic, deeply satisfying sight. But as I looked down at the man who had tried to destroy my life, I felt no pity. I felt only the cold, sharp clarity of justice. I stepped around his kneeling form, the train of my silk gown sweeping elegantly across the floor. I had successfully neutralized the primary threat, but the corporate audit of this corrupt family was not completely finished. My gaze swept past Liam and locked directly onto the front row. I bypassed the hyperventilating Sylvia and focused entirely on the woman sitting next to her. I turned my attention straight to Diana. Diana sat frozen in the front pew, completely paralyzed by the sudden shift in my attention. The designer silk dress she was so proud of now looked like a ridiculous cheap costume. Her perfectly manicured hands were gripping her expensive luxury clutch so tightly, her knuckles were stark white. She had spent the entire morning mocking me, complaining loudly about her husband's reluctance to buy a $10,000 watch and acting like she was the undisputed queen of Manhattan. Now she was staring up at me with wide, terrified eyes. She finally realized that if I had the technical ability to unearth Liam's deeply buried financial ruin, I likely knew every single detail about her desperate, illegal attempts to cover it up. I did not speak directly to Diana. She did not deserve my words or my time. Instead, I shifted my gaze slightly to the right, looking directly at the exhausted, hard-working African-American trauma surgeon sitting stiffly beside her. "Jamal," I said softly into the microphone. My voice echoed through the utterly silent cathedral, providing a stark, gentle contrast to the cold, punishing tone I had just used to destroy Liam. "You are the only decent person in this entire toxic family. You spend your days saving lives in the operating room, working grueling 80-hour shifts and treating everyone around you with genuine kindness and respect. You welcomed me with open arms and a beautiful custom bouquet of flowers this morning. You are a good man, Jamal. You absolutely do not deserve what is happening behind your back." Jamal sat up completely straight, his broad shoulders tensing as his brow furrowed in deep confusion. He had been watching Liam's spectacular downfall with the same shocked, breathless expression as the rest of the high society guests. "Please look at the cell phone sitting on your lap," I instructed gently, maintaining steady eye contact with him. "Open the PDF file I just texted you." A profound, heavy stillness fell over the 300 guests. Nobody dared to breathe. They watched with morbid fascination as Jamal slowly picked up his phone, his thumb tapping the glass screen to unlock it. He opened the encrypted text message I had sent him right before I walked down the aisle. As he stared down at the bright screen of his phone, I clicked the remote control in my hand one more time. The massive projector screen behind the altar shifted instantaneously. The real estate foreclosure document vanished, replaced by a highly detailed, officially certified bank wire ledger. It was a direct, irrefutable feed from Jamal and Diana's joint high-yield savings account. I made sure the presentation font was large enough for the wealthy elites sitting in the very back row of the cathedral to read the exact devastating numbers. "Take a good look at your house down payment fund, Jamal," I said, my voice ringing out with crystal clarity. "The money you spent the last 5 years diligently saving. The money you earned by sacrificing your sleep, your weekends, and your physical health to build a solid foundation for your marriage. It is entirely gone." I used the digital pointer on my remote control to highlight a massive, unauthorized withdrawal recorded just 2 weeks ago. "Your wife did not just encourage her brother's delusional financial gambling," I explained to the captivated crowd, finally turning my cold stare back to Diana, who was now trembling uncontrollably in her seat. "When Liam needed emergency liquid cash to keep the angry hedge fund from seizing this precious family estate, Diana completely bypassed your dual authorization security protocols. She forged your digital signature to authorize the transfer. She completely drained $500,000 of your hard-earned money and wired it directly into Liam's failing portfolio. She stole your entire future just to pay for their fake aristocratic image." Jamal did not look up at the giant screen behind me. He kept his eyes glued to his phone, scrolling methodically through the official bank statements I had provided. His handsome face went completely slack. The deep exhaustion that already weighed heavily on him seemed to multiply 100 times over in a single devastating second. I watched his heart break in real time. He had endured her endless complaints, her shallow vanity, and her constant entitled demands for luxury goods because he genuinely loved her. And she had repaid his unwavering devotion by committing federal wire fraud to rob him blind. Suddenly, Diana completely snapped. The terrifying reality of her husband discovering her massive criminal betrayal completely shattered her arrogant composure. "No!" Diana shrieked, her voice a piercing, hysterical wail that echoed terribly against the high stone ceilings of the church. She lunged violently sideways in the wooden pew, wildly throwing her hands toward Jamal to snatch the phone away from him. "It is a lie. Jamal, do not look at it. She is a computer hacker. She fabricated all of those documents just to ruin our family. Give me the phone right now." She clawed frantically at his hands, sobbing violently, desperate to destroy the undeniable proof of her ultimate betrayal. Jamal did not flinch. He did not yell or try to match her frantic, hysterical energy. He simply stood up, his tall, broad frame towering over her pathetic, shrinking figure in the wooden pew. He easily and firmly pulled his hands away from her manic grip, holding his cell phone securely out of her reach. His face, usually so warm, patient, and full of life, was completely unrecognizable. It was a terrifying, heart-wrenching mixture of profound heartbreak and absolute cold fury. He looked down at the woman he had loved, the woman he had exhausted his own body to provide for, as if he were looking at a complete and total stranger. Diana realized physical force was not going to work. She immediately switched her tactics, falling back on the manipulative gaslighting she had used to control him for years. She looked up at him, her expensive mascara running down her face in thick dark streaks, and tried to play the ultimate victim. "Jamal, you have to listen to me," she pleaded, her voice a desperate, urgent whisper, meant to keep the surrounding elite guests from hearing her pathetic lies. I only did it because I was terrified. You work so much you are never home, and I was so stressed about my mother losing her house. I was going to put the money back before you even noticed it was gone. I did it for us, Jamal. I did it to protect our family reputation in this city. You forced me into this horrible position because you refused to help Liam when he needed it the most. You are making a huge deal out of a temporary family loan. The sheer audacity of her words hung heavily in the tense, silent air of the cathedral. She was actually trying to blame him for her federal felony. She was trying to weaponize his 80-hour work weeks, the very hospital shifts he took to buy her a dream house, as an excuse for stealing his life savings. Jamal shook his head slowly, a bitter, humorless smile touching the corners of his mouth. He did not raise his voice, but in the dead silence of the church, his words carried with devastating, undeniable clarity. "You did not do this for us, Diana." Jamal replied, his voice vibrating with a deep, resonant anger that made the wealthy guests in the nearby pews physically lean back in discomfort. "You did this to maintain a fake, pathetic image. Just this morning, you stood in the bridal suite and screamed at me for not buying your brother a $10,000 luxury watch. You called me a failure because I only wrote him a $2,000 check. All while you knew you had already stolen $500,000 from my bank account." Diana opened her mouth to argue, but Jamal cut her off, his voice hardening into steel. "I spent the last 5 years standing on my feet in emergency rooms covered in blood trying to save actual lives, so I could give you the beautiful future you demanded." Jamal continued, his eyes burning with betrayed fury. "And you threw all of my sacrifice into a furnace to save a house your mother cannot even afford to keep. You do not care about me. You do not respect my hard work. You only care about the bank account attached to my name." Diana reached out, her hands trembling violently, trying to grab the fabric of his tailored charcoal suit jacket. "Jamal, please," she sobbed completely, abandoning her quiet whisper and wailing openly in front of the entire congregation. "Please do not do this right now. We can fix this. We can go to counseling. I will get a retail job. I will pay you back every single cent. Just sit down. Everyone is staring at us. Everyone is staring because you finally showed them exactly who you are," Jamal said coldly, completely ignoring her grasping hands. He looked down at his left hand. Without a single moment of hesitation, he reached over and slid the heavy gold wedding band off his ring finger. The metal caught the bright afternoon light filtering through the stained glass windows as he held it up for a fraction of a second. Then he let it fall. The ring dropped perfectly into the center of her expensive designer lap. "My lawyer will serve you the divorce papers on Monday morning," Jamal stated, his voice stripped of all emotion, delivering the final fatal blow to her fabricated world. "I will be securing my medical practice and freezing all of our remaining joint accounts before I even leave the parking lot today. Do not call my phone. Do not show up at my hospital. Do not ever contact me again." Jamal did not wait for her response. He did not look at Sylvia, who was still hyperventilating in the front row, or Liam, who was still kneeling defeated at the altar. Jamal simply turned his back on the entire toxic family. He stepped out into the center aisle of the cathedral and began to walk. His footsteps echoed loudly against the marble floor, steady and purposeful. The 300 high society guests, the people Diana had been so desperate to impress, parted like the Red Sea, watching in absolute silence and deep respect as the brilliant surgeon walked away from the wreckage of his marriage. The heavy oak doors of the church opened and closed behind him with a resounding thud. The first pillar of their fake empire had officially crumbled, leaving the rest of the family completely exposed to my final judgment. The heavy oak doors of the church opened and closed behind him with a resounding thud. The sound echoed through the silent cathedral, serving as the final death knell for Diana's marriage. She collapsed sideways into the wooden pew, burying her face in her hands, her loud, ugly sobs vibrating through the quiet room. The first pillar of their fake empire had officially crumbled, leaving the rest of the family completely exposed to my final judgment. But the absolute destruction of her daughter life was not what finally broke Sylvia. It was the terrifying, undeniable realization that the money was entirely gone. Jamal was not going to bail them out. I was not going to bail them out. The $3 million debt was incredibly real. The foreclosure on her Hamptons estate was absolute, and the high society friends she had spent decades trying to impress were currently watching her entire dynasty burn to the ground. Sylvia completely snapped. The carefully crafted mask of aristocratic elegance she wore like a second skin melted away in an instant, revealing the feral, desperate creature hiding underneath. "You miserable little witch!" Sylvia shrieked, her voice tearing through the cathedral like scraping metal. She lunged out of the front pew, completely ignoring her sobbing daughter. Her expensive silver designer gown caught on the sharp corner of the wooden bench, tearing the delicate silk fabric, but she did not even notice the damage. She charged up the center aisle, her eyes wide and bloodshot, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unhinged hatred. The sophisticated matriarch of Manhattan was gone. In her place was a cornered, vicious animal, realizing it had been outsmarted by its own prey. "You think you can do this to us?" Sylvia screamed, her expensive heels clicking wildly against the marble steps of the altar. "You think you can just walk into my family and destroy everything we built? You are nothing. You are a worthless, uneducated orphan who came from the absolute gutter. We gave you the ultimate privilege of wearing our family name, and this is how you repay us. I will destroy you. I will ruin your entire pathetic life." She raised her manicured hands, curling her fingers into tight claws, fully intending to physically attack me right there at the altar, in front of 300 horrified guests. She was aiming straight for my face, desperate to wipe the cold, victorious smile off my lips. I did not even blink. I did not take a single step backward. Before Sylvia could even reach the second step of the altar, two massive men in sharp black suits materialized from the side shadows of the church. My private security detail moved with terrifying silent efficiency. They intercepted her mid-charge, stepping firmly between us and forming an impenetrable human wall of solid muscle. Sylvia crashed hard into them. The impact knocked the breath out of her lungs, but the sheer adrenaline of her rage kept her moving. She thrashed wildly against the security guards, kicking her expensive heels and swinging her arms like a chaotic pendulum. "Let me go!" she wailed, her perfectly styled hair falling around her face in a sweaty, disheveled mess. She clawed frantically at the thick fabric of the guard suits, completely losing her mind. "You absolute trash! You stole my house! You ruined my son! I will have you arrested. I will have you thrown into the street where you belong. Let go of me right now." The security guards did not flinch. They simply gripped her arms with professional, unyielding force, easily holding her back as she kicked and screamed. The wealthy elites sitting in the pews watched the spectacle in absolute breathless horror. The woman who had spent the last 10 years judging their outfits, critiquing their vacation homes, and acting like the undisputed queen of their social circle was now foaming at the mouth, physically fighting security guards at the altar of a church. Her social ruin was complete and entirely irreversible. Nobody in that room would ever answer her phone calls again. I watched her thrash for a few seconds, absorbing the absolute pathetic reality of her existence. Then I completely dismissed her from my mind. She was no longer a threat. She was just a noisy, desperate distraction. I turned my attention back to the primary target. I gathered the heavy silk fabric of my wedding gown in one hand and slowly stepped down the marble stairs of the altar. I moved gracefully, my posture perfectly straight, until I was standing directly on the main floor. I stopped right in front of Liam. He was still kneeling on the cold stone, his shoulders slumped, his arrogance completely shattered. Hearing his mother screaming like a lunatic had only deepened his profound despair. He slowly tilted his head back and looked up at me. His eyes were red and brimming with desperate tears. He pressed his trembling hands together, looking up at the woman he had tried to exploit, and opened his mouth to beg for mercy. "Nora, please!" He choked out his voice, a pathetic wet whisper that barely carried past the first row of pews. "I am so sorry. I was desperate. The margin call was going to ruin my family. I love you, Nora. I really do. We can fix this. Just give me a chance to explain. Do not leave me like this in front of everyone." I looked down at his tear-stained face with absolute unyielding disgust. The man who had spent the last year acting like the undisputed king of Wall Street was now reduced to a sniveling, begging child. He was still trying to use his fake affection to manipulate his way out of a trap that had already snapped shut. "Did you really think I just came here to embarrass you, Liam?" I asked, my voice ringing with icy authority through the microphone. "Did you think my only goal today was to expose your pathetic lies, drop the microphone, and walk out of this church, leaving you crying at the altar?" I shook my head slowly, allowing a cold, razor-sharp smile to touch my lips. "No, Liam, I am not just a scorned bride seeking petty emotional revenge. I am a businesswoman. I built a $45 million empire by anticipating the moves of corporate predators and completely neutralizing them, and I never leave a hostile negotiation without securing my assets and punishing the opposition." I reached into the hidden pocket of my wedding gown for the final time. I pulled out a thick, neatly folded stack of legal documents. They were not printed on standard hotel paper. They were bound with a heavy legal cover bearing the official embossed logo of Apex Capital, the exact New York hedge fund that had been hunting him for the past 6 months. I tossed the heavy stack of papers through the air. They hit his chest with a sharp slap before sliding down his expensive tuxedo and landing flat on the marble floor right between his knees. "When I discovered your massive margin debt last night, I did not just sit back and watch you burn," I explained, pacing slowly around his kneeling figure. I wanted everyone in the room to hear exactly how a real financial acquisition was executed. I told my corporate attorney to contact the senior partners at Apex Capital the absolute second the financial markets opened this morning. They were holding $3.2 million of highly toxic debt from a disgraced unemployed banker who had absolutely zero liquid capital to pay them back. They were thrilled to unload the burden. "I used my emergency corporate slush fund to buy your entire debt portfolio for pennies on the dollar." Liam stared down at the documents resting on the cold floor. His eyes widened in absolute, unadulterated horror as he recognized the bold signatures of the hedge fund executives printed right next to the signature of my corporate attorney. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. "I am officially your sole creditor," Liam announced, letting the crushing weight of those words settle over the utterly silent cathedral. "I do not just own the primary lien on your mother precious Hampton's estate. I own the lien on your custom Porsche. I own the deed to your luxury penthouse apartment in Manhattan. And because you so foolishly used her assets to cross-collateralize your risky options trading when you were desperately trying to cover your massive losses, I now hold the absolute legal rights to your mother's entire retirement fund." A strangled, horrifying gasp erupted from the back of the church where Sylvia was still being firmly restrained by my security team. She had stopped fighting the guards. She had heard every single word echoing through the speakers. The reality of her total financial annihilation had finally arrived. She was not just losing her summer home. She was losing her entire future, her retirement, her luxury lifestyle, and her own son had handed it directly to me on a silver platter. "You tried to forge a federal contract to steal my company," I said, coming to a stop right in front of Liam and looking down into his terrified, vacant eyes. "You thought you could trap me in a fake marriage to serve as your personal unlimited bank account. You thought I was just a naive girl who would blindly sign away my life work. But you fundamentally misunderstood the game we were playing. I did not just protect my money today, I bought your entire life." Liam remained completely silent. His breath hitched violently in his throat. He looked at the legal documents on the floor, then slowly looked back up at me, his mind finally grasping the absolute inescapable reality of his situation. He was not just publicly shamed in front of his high society friends. He was not just facing a federal prison sentence for felony forgery. He was legally and financially enslaved to the very woman he had arrogantly tried to scam. Every single dollar he ever made, every asset he ever tried to acquire, would belong exclusively to me until his massive $3 million debt was completely satisfied. He was entirely mine to destroy. I stood there for a long moment, letting the absolute silence of the cathedral absorb the finality of my words. I looked down at Liam one last time. The arrogant, wealthy investment banker who had confidently walked into this church just an hour ago was completely gone. In his place was an empty, broken shell of a man sobbing quietly over a stack of financial documents that legally sealed his ruin. He did not try to argue anymore. He did not reach out to grab my hand. He just stared blankly at the marble floor, completely paralyzed by the catastrophic reality he had brought upon himself. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. He had dug his own grave with a silver spoon, and I had simply provided the tombstone. I turned my back on him. I did not look at Sylvia, who was still slumped against the wooden pew, completely drained of her feral rage, and now weeping pathetically into her hands. I did not spare a single glance for Diana, who was left entirely alone, having lost both her husband and her family fabricated wealth in a matter of minutes. Their toxic dynasty was officially dismantled. My work at the altar was completely finished. I gathered the heavy silk fabric of my custom wedding gown in my hands, lifted my chin high, and began my descent down the marble steps. As my heels clicked sharply against the floor, a profound shift occurred within the cathedral. The 300 high society guests, the very same people who had whispered cruel jokes about my modest background and pitied the poor orphan girl as I walked down this exact same aisle just 20 minutes ago, were now completely frozen in place. They did not whisper, they did not point, they did not even dare to breathe too loudly. As I approached the center aisle, the guests sitting in the inner seats physically leaned away from me, pulling their expensive coats and designer bags closer to their chests. They parted like the Red Sea, creating a wide, clear path for me to walk through. I looked directly into their faces as I walked past the wooden pews. The condescending smirks and arrogant pity had been entirely wiped away. Instead, I saw sheer, unadulterated terror and absolute respect. These were ruthless corporate executives, cutthroat lawyers, and wealthy socialites who spent their entire lives evaluating power dynamics and crushing their competition. They recognized a true predator when they saw one. They realized that the quiet, unassuming tech worker they had mocked over champagne was actually a financial mastermind who had effortlessly executed a multi-million-dollar hostile takeover right in front of their eyes. I had exposed their golden boy as a desperate fraud, bought his debt, and legally claimed his entire future. A few rows down, I made brief eye contact with one of Liam's groomsmen, the same man who had laughed about my supposedly cheap dress. He immediately dropped his gaze to the floor, his face pale, completely unable to look me in the eye. It was incredibly satisfying to watch their fabricated superiority crumble into dust. I did not need their validation. I did not need their acceptance into their exclusive, pretentious world. I had built my own empire from a cramped college dorm room, surviving on sheer willpower, and I carried my power entirely within myself. The silk train of my gown glided smoothly over the marble floor, sweeping away the last remnants of the pathetic illusion I had almost married into. Every step I took away from that altar felt like shedding a suffocating weight. I was leaving behind the lies and the exhausting demands of a family that only viewed me as a human bank account. I continued my steady, measured pace toward the back of the cathedral. My private security team immediately stepped away from the heavy oak doors of the control booth and moved to escort me. Two of the massive guards took the lead, pushing open the towering wooden doors of the church entrance. A brilliant wave of bright New York sunshine flooded into the dark, heavy atmosphere of the cathedral. I stepped across the threshold and out into the warm, crisp afternoon air. The chaotic, vibrant energy of the city greeted me like a familiar friend. The distant sound of taxi horns and the hum of bustling traffic felt like a glorious awakening. I stopped at the top of the grand stone stairs leading down to the street. I reached up with both hands, grabbed the delicate lace edge of my bridal veil, and tore it completely off my head. I ripped it away from my hair and let the expensive white fabric fall carelessly onto the concrete steps, leaving it behind like discarded trash. I took a deep, unrestricted breath of fresh air. I was not a victim. I was completely, undeniably free. Exactly 1 month later, the crisp air of early autumn settled over Manhattan. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office, looking out over the sprawling city skyline. My high-tech cybersecurity firm occupied the top 3 floors of a sleek glass-enclosed building in the financial district. Behind me, the steady hum of secure servers and the quiet chatter of my engineering team provided a comforting soundtrack to my new reality. The simple silk wedding dress was gone. The delicate lace veil was long forgotten. Today, I wore a sharply tailored navy blue suit entirely focused on the massive stack of legal documents resting on my polished glass desk. The intercom on my desk buzzed sharply. It was my executive assistant letting me know that Gregory, my lead corporate attorney, was holding on a secure encrypted line. I pressed the flashing green button and picked up the receiver, keeping my eyes fixed on the bustling city streets far below. I felt a deep sense of absolute control that I had not felt since the day I first met Liam. "Good morning, Gregory," I said, taking a slow sip of black coffee. "Tell me you have good news regarding the final asset liquidation and the criminal investigation." "Better than good." Nora Gregory replied, his voice brimming with intense professional satisfaction. "We just received the official notice from the federal prosecutor office. The grand jury returned a unanimous decision late last night. Liam has been formally indicted on multiple felony counts, including wire fraud, attempting to execute a forged legal document, and defrauding a financial institution. The FBI arrested him at a cheap roadside motel early this morning. Bail was completely denied due to his severe flight risk and his total lack of liquid assets. He is currently sitting in a federal holding cell awaiting trial. He tried to offer them a plea deal, but the data forensics evidence you provided was so overwhelmingly absolute that the prosecutors refused to negotiate. A wave of profound, quiet vindication washed over me. He had spent his entire life manipulating people, hiding behind his expensive suits, and his mother fabricated wealth. He had genuinely believed he was untouchable. Now he was facing the cold, unyielding reality of the federal justice system, stripped of all his arrogant armor. "And the civil side of the operation?" I asked, turning away from the window and sitting down in my ergonomic leather chair. "Have we successfully seized all the collateral from his defaulted loans? Absolutely everything is locked down under your new holding company," Gregory confirmed, shuffling heavy paper files on his end of the line. "Because you officially purchased his $3.2 million margin debt from the Apex Capital Hedge Fund on the morning of the wedding, you became his undisputed primary lien holder. When Liam inevitably missed the final grace period payment 3 weeks ago, we executed the foreclosure clauses with extreme prejudice. We seized his luxury penthouse apartment in the city, effectively evicting him with only 24 hours' notice. We liquidated his custom sports car. We even froze his entire retirement portfolio, just as you instructed, because he had foolishly listed her remaining accounts as cross-collateral for his high-risk options trading. They are entirely wiped out. They do not have a single penny left to hire a decent defense attorney." I pulled the top file from the stack on my desk. It contained the itemized list of all the seized physical assets we had confiscated from the Hamptons estate before preparing the massive property for public auction. Sylvia had been forcefully escorted off the premises by local sheriffs, screaming and crying the entire time, carrying only a single plastic suitcase of clothes. Every single piece of expensive antique furniture, every crystal chandelier, and every piece of fine art now legally belonged to my holding company to offset her son's massive financial debt. There is one minor detail we need your final approval on, Gregory continued, interrupting my thoughts. We have secured Sylvia customized luxury sedan. It is currently sitting in our private impound lot. The vehicle is fully paid off and holds a very significant resale value on the secondary luxury market. Do you want me to transfer the title into your personal name, or should we just roll it into the corporate fleet for your executives to use when entertaining clients? I leaned back in my chair, picturing Sylvia riding around the Hamptons in that ridiculously expensive car, looking down her nose at everyone she deemed beneath her social status. She had used that car as a weapon of intimidation, a shiny metal shield to hide her rotting financial reality. The thought of keeping it disgusted me. I wanted absolutely nothing that carried the foul stench of their toxic entitlement. Neither, I replied smoothly, my voice cold and fiercely decisive. I want you to contact a luxury auto broker immediately. Sell the car for cash today. Do not bother negotiating for top dollar. Just get rid of it as quickly as possible. And the proceeds from the sale. Gregory asked, his pen scratching against paper as he took notes. Where should I route the funds once the broker clears the transaction? I looked back out the window at the bright morning sky. Send every single cent of the profit directly to the downtown women's shelter for domestic abuse survivors, I instructed. Make sure the financial donation is made completely anonymously. Sylvia spent her entire life using her wealth to intimidate, belittle, and crush vulnerable people. It is only fitting that the last valuable thing she ever owned will be used to protect and empower the exact kind of women she used to mock. Consider it done, Nora, Gregory said, chuckling softly at the brilliant poetic justice of the instruction. I will send over the final foreclosure deeds for your signature this afternoon. Have a wonderful day. You too, Gregory, I replied before placing the receiver back onto its base. I let out a long, satisfying breath and leaned back in my chair. The morning sun was climbing higher over the Manhattan skyline, casting brilliant rays of light across my pristine glass desk. I had successfully dismantled a generational fraud, protected my $45 million company, and secured a very profitable portfolio of seized assets. It was a remarkably productive morning. I turned my attention back to my laptop to review the quarterly earnings report for my cybersecurity firm, but before I could open the financial spreadsheet, a small notification window popped up in the upper right corner of my screen. It was an automated alert from LinkedIn suggesting new professional connections based on my imported contacts and previous network algorithms. Usually, I completely ignore these automated suggestions, but the name flashing across the small digital banner caught my immediate attention. It was an update regarding Diana. I clicked on the notification, allowing her newly updated professional profile to fill my screen. A cold, cynical smile touched my lips as I read the desperate, pathetic reality of her new life. Diana had spent her entire adult life mocking working-class people. She used to proudly refer to herself as a high-society lifestyle influencer. A completely fabricated title she used to justify spending her days shopping at luxury boutiques and sipping expensive champagne, while her husband exhausted himself at the hospital. Her profile picture was an old, heavily filtered photograph from her wealthy days, showing her wearing designer sunglasses on a private yacht. But her current employment status told a drastically different story. Under her work experience, she had just listed a brand new position: Customer Experience Associate at a mid-tier discount retail chain. She was working an entry-level retail job, folding cheap sweaters and ringing up clearance items for minimum wage. The sheer, undeniable poetry of her downfall was magnificent. I knew exactly how she had ended up wearing a cheap polyester uniform instead of her custom silk dresses. Jamal had kept his promise with absolute devastating precision. On the Monday morning following the disastrous wedding, he had unleashed a team of aggressive divorce attorneys on his soon-to-be ex-wife. He did not give her a single inch to breathe or manipulate the narrative. During the initial settlement negotiations, Diana had audaciously tried to demand massive monthly alimony payments, claiming she had sacrificed her own earning potential to support his medical career. But Jamal attorneys simply placed the certified bank wire ledger on the table, the exact same document I had projected on the massive screen at the cathedral. They reminded Diana that she had committed federal wire fraud by forging his digital signature to steal $500,000. They gave her a very simple, brutal ultimatum. She could either sign a total waiver of all marital assets and walk away with absolutely nothing, or Jamal would hand the bank records directly to the district attorney and press criminal charges that would send her to a federal women prison for the next 10 years. Faced with the terrifying reality of a jail cell, Diana completely folded. She signed the divorce papers forfeiting any claim to Jamal's future earnings, his retirement accounts, and his medical practice. She was completely stripped of his massive income. And because I had systematically seized every single asset belonging to Sylvia and Liam, her toxic family could not offer her a single dime of financial support. She was drowning in massive legal fees from the divorce, entirely cut off from the wealthy social circles she used to dominate. The women she used to call her best friends had immediately blocked her phone number the second her family bankruptcy became public knowledge. Now the woman who had screamed at her husband for not buying a $10,000 luxury watch was forced to stand on her feet for 8 hours a day, dealing with angry customers and struggling to pay the rent for a tiny run-down studio apartment. She was finally experiencing the grueling reality of hard work that she had mocked Jamal for enduring. Jamal, on the other hand, was thriving. According to the Medical Community Network updates, he had recently been promoted to the head of the trauma surgery department. He had successfully protected his hard-earned savings and officially closed on a beautiful house in the suburbs entirely in his own name. He had surgically removed the parasitic tumor from his life, and he was finally free to enjoy the success he had built with his own 2 hands. I stared at Diana's profile for another moment, feeling no pity, only a profound sense of cosmic balance. She had tried to help her brother destroy my life, and the resulting shockwave had completely incinerated hers. I did not need to send her a mocking message or gloat over her spectacular failure. She was already living her own personal nightmare every single time she clocked in for her retail shift. I hovered my mouse cursor over the small icon on the screen. With a single definitive click, I permanently deleted the notification and blocked her profile. They were completely and permanently erased from my digital ecosystem. I closed the window, opened my corporate financial reports, and went back to running my empire. I had barely analyzed the first page of my quarterly corporate financial reports when the sleek intercom console on my desk lit up with a flashing amber light. It was a direct priority line from the main reception desk in the ground floor lobby of my building. I reached out and pressed the silver button, expecting to hear that my lunch order had arrived or that a scheduled vendor was running late. Instead, the voice of my head receptionist, a highly trained security professional, came through the speaker with a tight, cautious tone. "Ms. Nora, I am incredibly sorry to interrupt your morning workflow," the receptionist stated formally. "We have a situation down here at the primary security checkpoint. There is an older woman in the lobby demanding to see you. She bypassed the visitor logs and refuses to leave the premises. She claims it is a dire family emergency and insists she needs exactly 5 minutes of your time. Her name is Sylvia." My hands completely stopped typing on the keyboard. A cold, sharp wave of absolute disbelief washed over me. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of this woman was almost difficult to comprehend. After orchestrating a massive financial fraud, actively trying to steal half of my company, attempting to trap me in a legally binding nightmare, and physically attacking my security guards at the altar of a church, Sylvia actually believed she could simply walk through the front doors of my corporate headquarters and demand an audience. She thought the rules of basic human decency somehow did not apply to her. I did not immediately respond to the receptionist. Instead, I minimized my financial spreadsheets and opened the live security camera feed for the ground floor lobby on my primary monitor. I clicked on the high-definition camera positioned directly above the reception desk and zoomed in on the scene unfolding downstairs. The woman standing in my pristine modern lobby looked absolutely nothing like the arrogant high society matriarch who had spent the entire last year constantly mocking my modest upbringing. The transformation was jarring and deeply pathetic. Sylvia looked like she had aged 10 years in a single month. Her signature silver hair, which was usually styled into an immaculate expensive blowout before she stepped foot outside. Her mansion was completely flat, greasy, and pulled back into a sloppy, uneven knot. Her face was completely devoid of her usual heavy designer makeup, revealing deep dark bags under her eyes, and a pale, sickly complexion that spoke volumes about her new reality. But the most glaring indicator of her total financial ruin was her clothing. The woman who used to loudly critique the thread count of my silk dresses was currently wearing a mismatched out-of-season heavy wool coat over a faded, wrinkled blouse. The fabric looked cheap and thoroughly worn. She was clutching a flimsy plastic shopping bag instead of her usual leather designer clutch. She was actively weeping, her thin shoulders shaking violently as she desperately pleaded with the towering security guard who was firmly blocking her path to the executive elevators. I watched her wipe her nose with the back of her hand, completely abandoning any remaining shred of her fake aristocratic dignity. I could not hear the audio through the security camera feed, but I could easily read her frantic, exaggerated body language. She was begging. She was likely facing eviction from whatever cheap rundown motel she had managed to find after my holding company successfully seized her Hamptons estate. Or perhaps she was desperate for cash to put into Liam Federal Prison commissary account so her golden boy could buy extra soap. She had exhausted all of her wealthy friends, alienated her own daughter, and had absolutely nowhere else to turn in the entire city. She had crawled all the way from her penthouse lifestyle to the very bottom of the gutter, and now she was looking up at the woman she had once called an uneducated orphan, desperately hoping for a massive financial handout. Part of me wondered if she actually expected me to feel a sudden surge of guilt. Society often conditions women to be the ultimate peacekeepers, to forgive highly toxic family members simply because they are crying and looking pathetic in public. Sylvia was clearly banking on that exact societal conditioning. She thought my compassion would magically override my common sense. She thought I would take pity on an old, broken woman. But she fundamentally misunderstood who was sitting in the chief executive office today. I did not build a multi-million-dollar cybersecurity fortress by showing mercy to the ruthless hackers and corporate predators who tried to infiltrate my secure servers. And I was certainly not going to show mercy to the architect of my attempted financial ruin. I stared at her weeping face on the high-definition monitor for exactly 10 more seconds, feeling absolutely nothing but cold clinical detachment. I reached out and firmly pressed the intercom button on my desk. "I see her on the security feed right now," I said, my voice projecting absolute icy authority through the speaker. "Do not let her anywhere near the elevator banks. Throw her out of the building immediately. And if she ever sets foot on this commercial property again, do not bother calling my office. Just lock the lobby doors and call the police for criminal trespassing." I released the button, completely cutting off the connection to the front desk. Complete enforcement of boundaries was the only language a parasite truly understood. I stood up from my desk, smoothed the front of my navy blue suit jacket, and completely pushed Sylvia out of my mind. I had far more important matters to attend to. 10 minutes later, I walked through the double glass doors of the primary executive boardroom. The massive room was lined with panoramic windows overlooking the financial district, but the attention of every single person inside was fixed directly on the head of the long mahogany table. 12 of my top shareholders, senior executives, and primary venture capital investors were already seated waiting for the quarterly strategy meeting to begin. I took my seat at the head of the table, opened my laptop, and immediately projected our latest financial metrics onto the digital smart screen on the wall. The transition of my personal equity into the offshore blind trust had required a complete corporate restructuring, and today was the first time the newly formed board of directors was meeting in person. "We are going to start by reviewing the third quarter acquisition metrics," I announced, diving straight into the agenda without any unnecessary small talk. As you can see on the projected graph, our gross profit margins have expanded by 14% following the integration of our new forensic software contracts. Before I could transition to the next slide, a loud, deliberate cough interrupted me. It came from Trent, a senior partner at a major venture capital firm that held a minor but vocal stake in my company. Trent was a textbook corporate dinosaur, a man who consistently underestimated female founders and preferred the outdated boys' club mentality of Wall Street. He leaned back in his plush leather chair, twirling an expensive silver pen between his fingers, and offered me a condescending, deeply patronizing smile. "Those numbers look decent on paper." Nora Trent interrupted, his voice dripping with fake concern. "But the board and I have been discussing some broader operational risks. We are all aware of the highly public, rather messy disruptions in your recent personal life." The room went completely silent. Several of my senior engineers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but I kept my posture perfectly rigid and my expression entirely blank. Trent continued, emboldened by the silence. "A cancelled high society wedding, a federal fraud investigation involving your former fiancé, and a massive emergency restructuring of your personal equity into an offshore trust. That is a significant amount of emotional turbulence for a solo female founder to handle. Some of our investors are worried that you might be too distracted to maintain the aggressive growth strategy we demand. Perhaps it is time we discuss appointing an interim co-chief executive officer to help shoulder the burden while you take some time to recover from your trauma." He was trying to use the destruction of Liam as a weapon to strip me of my own corporate power. He wanted to frame my brilliant defensive maneuver as a sign of emotional instability. I did not raise my voice. I did not act defensive or offended. I simply reached forward and tapped a single key on my laptop. The graph on the smart screen shifted instantly. It displayed the highly classified financial ledger of the Apex Capital debt acquisition I had executed on the morning of my wedding. "My personal life is not a disruption, Trent," I replied smoothly, my voice cold and echoing with absolute authority in the quiet boardroom. "It is a highly profitable revenue stream." I stood up from my chair and pointed a laser presenter at the staggering numbers on the screen. "Let us review the exact financial details of my so-called trauma. While you were sleeping on the morning of my wedding, I executed a flawless hostile takeover of a $3 million margin debt. I purchased it for pennies on the dollar using a secondary holding company. Within 3 weeks, I foreclosed on a multi-million-dollar Hamptons estate, seized a Manhattan penthouse, and liquidated a luxury vehicle fleet. That single morning operation yielded a net profit return of over 400% for my private portfolio." I turned my gaze away from the screen and locked eyes directly with Trent. His patronizing smile had completely vanished. He stopped twirling his expensive pen. "Furthermore," I continued, my voice sharp and unrelenting, "the offshore blind trust you seem so concerned about has completely immunized this company from any future domestic civil litigation or hostile asset seizures. I did not restructure out of emotional panic. I restructured to build an absolute fortress around our intellectual property. I am currently operating at the highest level of strategic efficiency this company has ever seen. I do not need a break. I do not need a co-chief executive. And I certainly do not need a venture capitalist who cannot read a basic asset seizure ledger telling me how to manage my trauma." The silence in the boardroom was now heavy with sheer intimidation. Trent swallowed hard, his face flushing a deep, embarrassed red. He looked around the table, desperately hoping one of the other male investors would jump in to support him. But nobody dared to speak. They had just witnessed me financially eviscerate a man at the altar, and they clearly had no desire to be my next target. Trent slowly lowered his eyes to his notepad. "You make a very compelling point, Nora," he mumbled quietly, completely defeated. "The numbers speak for themselves. We support your continued solo leadership." I turned off the laser pointer and sat back down at the head of the table. I surveyed the room of powerful executives, knowing beyond a shadow of a doubt that my authority would never be questioned again. I reigned supreme in my boardroom. Excellent, I said, clicking to the next slide. Now let us discuss our upcoming international expansion strategy. Excellent, I said, clicking to the next slide. Now let us discuss our upcoming international expansion strategy. By 8 o'clock that evening, the grueling strategy meeting was a distant memory. I had officially finalized the paperwork for a massive corporate merger, successfully expanding my digital forensics and cybersecurity firm into the highly lucrative European market. To celebrate this monumental victory, I decided to treat myself to a quiet evening at one of the most exclusive rooftop bars in Manhattan. The venue was a private members-only lounge perched 50 stories above the glittering city streets, offering a breathtaking panoramic view of the skyline. I sat alone at a corner table near the glass railing, wearing a sleek black evening dress, feeling the cool autumn breeze against my skin. The ambient jazz music and the soft hum of wealthy patrons provided the perfect relaxing backdrop for my quiet victory lap. I was not there to network. I was not there to find a new romantic partner or engage in idle social chatter. I was simply there to enjoy the absolute freedom of my own company. After spending the last year dealing with Liam and his suffocating parasitic family, sitting alone in a beautiful place felt like the ultimate luxury. I watched the headlights of the cars far below, tracing lines of gold through the city grid, reflecting on the incredible trajectory of my life. I had built an empire from scratch, protected it from a hostile corporate predator, and expanded its reach globally. I was entirely self-sufficient, and I owed my success to no one but myself. My peaceful solitude was abruptly interrupted when a tall, classically handsome man approached my table. He looked to be in his late 30s, wearing a sharply tailored charcoal suit that undoubtedly cost several $1,000s. He had the confident, effortless swagger of a man who was entirely used to getting exactly what he wanted. A heavy, expensive gold watch caught the dim lounge lighting as he leaned casually against the empty chair across from me. He flashed a brilliant, highly practiced smile that was clearly designed to disarm and charm. "Excuse me," he said, his voice deep and smooth. "I could not help but notice you sitting over here all by yourself. A beautiful woman like you should not be celebrating alone on a Friday night. Let me buy your next round. What are you drinking?" Before I could politely decline, he signaled the waiter over with a snap of his fingers. He looked back at me, his smile widening into a slightly arrogant smirk. "You look incredibly tense," he continued, completely uninvited. "I know exactly how to treat a woman who works too hard. Let me take care of you tonight. You deserve to turn your brain off and let a real man handle the bill." The absolute sheer cliché of his words made me want to roll my eyes. It was the exact same patronizing tone Liam used to use when he wanted to feel financially superior. This stranger saw a woman sitting alone and immediately assumed she was a damsel in distress, waiting for a wealthy knight to rescue her from her own independence. He viewed his bank account as a substitute for an actual personality. I did not smile back. I looked at the waiter who was hovering nervously nearby, and then looked directly into the eyes of the handsome stranger. "Thank you for the generous offer," I replied, my voice perfectly polite, but cold enough to freeze water. "But I am not tense. I am not looking for company, and I certainly do not need anyone to take care of me." I turned my attention fully to the waiter. "I will have a bottle of your finest vintage champagne," I instructed smoothly. "And please bring the $200 check directly to me." I reached into my designer evening clutch, pulled out my heavy metal black card, and placed it firmly on the polished glass table. The handsome stranger blinked, his practiced smile instantly dissolving into an expression of awkward embarrassment. He looked down at my exclusive corporate card, then back up at my completely unbothered face. The realization that I likely possessed a net worth significantly larger than his own completely shattered his arrogant confidence. He cleared his throat, suddenly, looking very small inside his expensive tailored suit. "Right," he muttered awkwardly, stepping away from the table. "Enjoy your evening." He quickly retreated back to the crowded bar area, his fragile ego thoroughly bruised. The waiter returned a few minutes later, pouring the crisp, expensive champagne into a crystal flute. I took a slow sip, enjoying the perfect bubbly perfection of the vintage wine. I looked back out over the glowing skyline of New York City, letting my mind drift. From the time we are little girls, society constantly trains women to seek saving. We are fed endless fairy tales about wealthy princes rescuing us from our modest lives. We are taught to view marriage as the ultimate financial safety net to compromise our own power for the illusion of security. But as I sat there, the sole owner of a global tech empire, I realized the absolute danger of that lie. When you wait for a knight in shining armor, you are completely at the mercy of the man inside the suit. And as I had learned the hard way with Liam, sometimes the knight is actually the dragon in disguise. Women do not need to be saved. We need to stop waiting for someone else to fight our battles and start learning how to hold the sword ourselves. I finished the last sip of my vintage champagne and set the crystal flute down on the table. I stood up and walked directly over to the edge of the rooftop terrace, resting my hands lightly on the thick glass railing. The glittering New York skyline stretched out endlessly before me, a massive grid of pulsing lights and soaring steel. It was a city built on ambition, a place where fortunes were made and lost in the blink of an eye. Tonight, looking down at the sprawling metropolis, I did not feel small. I felt like I owned every single inch of it. For the past year, I had allowed myself to be cast in a pathetic supporting role in someone else's fabricated drama. Liam and Sylvia had looked at me and seen a convenient victim. They saw a woman without a prominent family name, an orphan they assumed was desperately craving their high society validation. They tried to wrap their toxic manipulation in the guise of love and aristocratic acceptance, smiling warmly to my face, while they plotted in the shadows to steal the empire I had built with my own hands. They thought they could bury me under their arrogance and their forged legal documents. But that is the fundamental flaw of every toxic family and every arrogant predator. When they try to bury you in the dark, they completely fail to realize that you are a seed. They pile the heavy dirt of their gaslighting, their financial abuse, and their endless entitlement on top of you, fully expecting you to suffocate under the immense pressure. They never expect you to take root in that exact same darkness. They never expect you to draw profound strength from the cold reality of their betrayal, break through the surface, and grow into an unshakable force of nature. I did not just escape a bad marriage. Escaping implies running away in fear. Escaping means leaving the threat completely intact to hurt someone else down the line. I refused to just pack my bags and quietly walk away. Instead, I stood my ground and burned a corrupt generational dynasty completely to the ground. And the most beautiful part of their spectacular destruction was that I did not even have to invent a weapon to defeat them. I simply used their own insatiable greed against them. Liam desperate gamble in the high-risk options market. Diana incredibly selfish theft from her hardworking husband, and Sylvia desperate need to maintain an expensive illusion of wealth were the actual catalysts of their downfall. I was merely the digital auditor who finally balanced their corrupted ledgers. I used my skills in data forensics to rip away their expensive masks and expose the rotting foundation of their lives. I just provided the financial mirror that forced them to look at their own hideous reflections in front of all their peers. As the cool autumn wind swept across the rooftop terrace, tossing my hair around my shoulders, I felt a profound sense of peace. I thought about Jamal, the only good person in that entire lineage who was now building a beautiful, honest life, free from his wife's endless shallow demands. He had survived the blast radius of my revenge and found his own freedom. The heavy anxiety that had plagued me during my entire engagement was entirely gone, replaced by the sharp, clear focus of a woman who fully understood her own immense value. I had protected my $45 million company. I had secured a highly profitable portfolio of seized assets. But more importantly, I had secured my own independence. If you are listening to this right now and you find yourself shrinking to fit into a room where you are continually disrespected, I need you to hear my voice. Whether you are dealing with a toxic romantic partner, a manipulative family member, or an environment that constantly undervalues your brilliant contributions, you must stop waiting for them to suddenly recognize your worth. They never will. Your power does not come from their validation. Your power comes from the absolute certainty that you can walk away, buy the building, and construct your own table. The family I almost married into thought they had found the perfect easy mark. They thought their custom-tailored suits and their fake aristocratic accents would completely blind me to the reality of their massive, crippling debts. They wanted a naive bride to pay their debts. Instead, they invited the reaper to their dinner table. Never hand the pen that writes your story over to someone else, especially not on a marriage license. The most profound lesson to take away from this story is the absolute necessity of self-reliance and maintaining control over your own narrative. Society often conditions people, particularly women, to look for external validation or a savior in the form of a wealthy partner or a prestigious family. Liam presented himself as exactly that kind of savior. He hid his toxic intentions, massive financial debt, and criminal greed behind expensive custom suits and charming words. If Nora had accepted the traditional role of a passive, grateful bride, she would have lost the entire empire she worked so hard to build. Instead, Nora demonstrated that true security is never handed to you on a silver platter or a marriage license. It is built through hard work, vigilance, and the ultimate courage to face ugly truths. She did not let the emotional weight of a wedding or the crushing pressure of high society blind her to the reality of the forged contract. By taking immediate decisive action to protect her assets and outsmart her abusers, she proved that you must be the architect of your own rescue. Her story is a powerful reminder that personal boundaries are entirely meaningless without the strength and preparation to enforce them. When toxic people try to bury you, they rely heavily on your silence and your compliance. Nora refused to be a victim, choosing instead to use her intelligence to dismantle a corrupt dynasty. She reminds us all that we must learn to hold our own swords, rather than waiting for knights in shining armor, who might actually be dragons in disguise. Please share your own experiences with setting strict boundaries and claiming your independence in the comments below, and subscribe to join our community of strong survivors.